The following program is an original production of WICC PBS Chicago.
A ruling last year by the U.S. Supreme Court left intact affirmative action policies at the University of Texas at Austin, which could have a ripple effect upon colleges nationwide. The case challenged the use of race-based preferences in admissions policies and has some people questioning whether affirmative action is accomplishing what it set out to do. That's the focus of our discussion today on The Professors. Joining us to talk about college affirmative action programs are Ann Lucene, law professor at John Marshall Law School; Carolyn Schoenberger, attorney and professor at Harold Washington College; Michael Crenshaw, English professor at Daly College; and Pat Obey, director of the EMBA program and professor of finance at Purdue University Calumet. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, so we are talking today about an extremely controversial topic, and prior to the show, we were having some good conversations. I'm very excited about this because there's a lot of intellectual diversity at this table. I think we're going to have a very good discussion. Ann, you had mentioned beforehand that we'd ask you the question, are you in favor of affirmative action? And you go, well, what is affirmative action? Let's start there with the conversation around the definition of affirmative action.
Well, the original idea of affirmative action during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations was to go out and take positive steps to recruit minorities.
Sure.
In order to make sure that they applied for jobs or applied to universities. And now it has become what I call a much more nuanced situation, which is, do you start, in a sense, giving points, which was what they were talking about in the University of Texas case, for people who are not just minorities, but who may have come from disadvantaged educational backgrounds. In the case of Hispanics, frequently English in Texas.
Sure.
Hispanics frequently have English as their second language. Do you take that into consideration?
Now, the civil rights case in 1964 was not that broad, is what we realized. It wasn't really minorities. It wasn't really meant for women in that way, at least initially. Now, obviously, this is opened up for, we're looking at diversity as a whole. This is really written to address the problems of slavery and Jim Crow discrimination specifically. And now, really, the focus of affirmative action has changed.
Well, you can argue that even before that, the amendments after the Civil War were specifically targeting African Americans and Jim Crowism, and we couldn't even vote them.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah. 13, 14, 15 were all really specifically for African Americans. But that's changed, and we talk about this. One of the things that I talk about with my students a lot around the affirmative action question is, you know, Caucasian or European women are pretty heavy beneficiaries of affirmative action programs. Is that a good thing? Is that sort of where we are? And does it make sense to broaden affirmative action to not just be for sort of African Americans, but other minorities? You mentioned a case where Arab Americans were beneficiaries of affirmative action.
Yes, they're sometimes listed as minorities, likewise Iranian Americans. When I've asked why, the answer I've gotten is, well, for them, English is a second language. I said, not always.
Okay, all right. So does it make sense to open the door?
I think one of the wonderful things about our Constitution is that it is subject to interpretation, and as we change as a country and embrace more people, fortunately the Constitution is not set in stone.
Sure.
That it can be interpreted and has been differently, not narrowly. It can be narrowly interpreted.
Okay.
And it also can be amended, which is what women needed and other minorities needed in order to be able to have basic white rights the same as white males.
Okay.
Yeah, well,
but
since 1964, we've also learned that sexual orientation and physical handicap really can add diversity in a classroom too, and talk about groups that may be discriminated against. Those are two obvious ones.
Yeah, that's a good point, but I wanted to be sure that we didn't convolute some of the latter issues that define minority status with the intent of affirmative action. Because I think affirmative action, as it was established and as it has evolved over time, was designed as a program to rectify a previous imbalance. You can be minority but may not be disadvantaged when it comes to employment and education, for example, two key aspects that affirmative action targeted. So in the through the process, the intent was to identify ways that blacks in particular were disenfranchised in the prosperity of this nation, especially economically and educationally. And therefore, to implement these programs as a way to eventually create a level playing field for
and I think,
everyone.
Professor Obi, you make a very good point. I think that's a very clear distinction between that and the goal of diversity. So the goal of diversity, for instance, you mentioned things like sexual orientation. I would imagine that when the framers of the Civil Rights Act that included affirmative action, that was not their goal. Their goal was not to get a room with different people who think differently or whatever. Their goal was to deal with the legacy of slavery and the legacy of Jim Crow discrimination, which in many ways is still with us today. African American unemployment rates are twice as much as European American unemployment rates. And a variety of other factors we could look at suggest that there still are these challenges. And with all due respect to the sexual orientation diversity issue, that is not necessarily an economic issue because there's not necessarily the same level of economic, social, and educational discrimination that exists on a massive scale with the years of history. So there's probably a real distinction there. I think a lot of people have issue with that. I'm one of them as well.
Well, I mean, my biggest issue, and I've stated this many times, is that all and my friends and colleagues agree with this as well, all we want is a level playing field. And, you know, I want to be hired at your college because I'm good at what I do. I want to be accepted into your college because I'm one of the top high school students in the state.
I'm going to stop you for a second, and I want you to. I want to frame your comments because I think it's very important. You mentioned that you really don't like affirmative action.
Not at all.
Now I want you to explain that.
Not at all.
I think it helps us to understand that position.
I mean, I feel it's a necessary evil, you know, because I mean, I think we'd all be crazy to think that racism, institutional racism, doesn't exist. But I just find it very offensive when a college, you know, whether I'm applying to be a student or I'm applying to be a professor, says, okay, well, we're going to let you in because you're black, not because you're good.
Sure.
And I've experienced that, and I'm not going to name the college. Let's just say Daly College is my first rodeo.
Okay.
I know what it's like to be hired at a college where it's 25 faculty. You're the one of two African American teachers that are there. One teaches speech, the other one is me. I teach English. I walk in, we have departmental meetings. I'm sitting on the right side of the room in the corner. Whenever I try to inject any kind of things that I would like to have done in the department, they just say, oh, yeah, that's nice. Okay, we'll just continue with our own agenda. And then, heaven forbid, if I'm good at what I do,
Sure.
then all of a sudden students start leaving the white professors and start coming to my class,
Sure.
and now that really creates problems.
So you feel like it's really tokenism in a lot of ways, is what you're suggesting.
You're a token. You're put on display.
Okay.
They say, hey, look, see, we're
Sure.
hiring. We're hiring black people. See, we're hiring Hispanics. See, we're hiring women.
Okay.
Instead of saying, see, we're hiring quality.
Okay.
And that's what I'm looking for. And I think that that's one of the things that we are losing
Okay.
when it comes to affirmative action.
Now, I hate to bring this up, but I'm going to, and I want you to address it because you mentioned something before the show I think is interesting. You mentioned that you have experience with the affirmative action program where you felt like there wasn't quality that came out of it.
Actually, I didn't say that.
Well, you'd mentioned about some testing issues. And
No,
yeah.
what I was talking about is early in when colleges were starting affirmative action programs, the flunk out rate was significantly high.
Okay.
Okay. That is very different than how you characterize
I think
it.
it's pretty much the same thing, but you know, it's a quality issue. What you're suggesting is
No, I'm not.
okay. That's fine. I mean, I'm not saying that.
I happen to have teach at a very diverse school.
Sure.
I have brilliant students in every single race, gender, age.
Sure.
Absolutely wonderful students that I'm hoping will get to the college and the profession of their dreams.
Absolutely.
So, I was referring to something that took place in several of the law schools
Okay.
in the early 70s.
So whether it's about sort of your personal perspective on this or not, I don't want to make that the issue. What I want to make the issue is that a lot of people criticize affirmative action for cases like that. They suggest, not that I agree with this, but there's data that suggests that in your situation, the law school that you mentioned, and other places that there is concern about the level of ability to compete among students. Let's just be real. Let's put it on the table. Let's not sugarcoat it. Let's talk about it. So how do we deal with that, or what is that an issue?
One of the wonderful things that Harold Washington College and City Colleges does for everyone is offer tutoring programs, offering English writing labs, so that anyone who feels that they need the assistance, and in my business law classes, so a lot of students need to learn how to write. They can go there.
We are doing that now in law schools and generally in graduate schools. And isn't it high time?
I have had to show a couple of law students how to write a letter, and I'm not talking about the content. I'm talking about Professor and Mrs. and dear Professor and Mrs. and very truly yours and things like that.
I did want to touch upon two key issues, one of which is the point that you raised earlier, and I think that it's important that no one glosses over it, because when you convert affirmative action into a program where you are simply trying to show a face, you can invariably convert that face of a black person, in this case, to one creating an environment of inferiority complex, because to be honest with you, the individual may begin to feel that actually the only reason that he or she got the job, got the position, is because that person is black. So that is a danger that we cannot gloss over. Now on the flip side, though, we also have to be aware that because of past discriminations, that there were imbalances, significant imbalances that were created through time. And so what many institutions and organizations seek to do today is to create a type of affirmative action whereby if, for example, at Purdue University, if we are hiring for a position, now if we would first of all determine—
Do you have affirmative action in your program?
We actually do. Yeah, we actually do. But the way it works is if, let's say, Mike and Ann applied for a certain position, and both of them are equally qualified because the advertisement is going to specify the qualifications needed for the position. So first of all, we're going to have to determine whether there is a gaping hole in terms of the hiring of minorities for that particular position. So if in the past we have not had any minorities or black people in that position, then we'll give him preference in the event that both of you are equally qualified. Because as an institution of higher learning, we still go for the best individual out there, regardless of race.
I could accept that. If you had said, okay, we're hiring him because, okay, and then I would add,
but both
keep
of you
me in
would have
mind
to be
for your
equal.
next opening.
Exactly. But both of you have to be equally qualified, because that's a recognition of the facts on the ground, which is that there might have been imbalances in hiring in the past.
But that's very subjective, though, and that's really why people have so many issues.
That is interesting that you said it might be subjective.
Yes.
But actually, one of the things, and both of you here are lawyers, one of the things that you have to be very careful in position advertisements, especially in institutions of higher learning, is that you have to be specific regarding qualifications in terms of what degree you have to have, the field in which you have to have the degree, your research competency, your contributions in service, teaching, and research. So these can actually be specified in ways that you can literally tell if two individuals are equally qualified for a certain position.
There are a lot of factors, and I'll come to you in a second, but there are a lot of factors that go into hiring, and I think that specifically around the college admission question, most of these cases, the Michigan case, et cetera, essentially said, hey, wait a second, we can include race as a part of the equation, but not necessarily make it the end-all, be-all within the equation. And to me, that makes a lot of sense, along with income and that sort of thing. Now, the reality is that income is not typically used.
Factors.
Yeah, it is, but there are weights. Most college admissions, they have weights. Yes, they have, and they weigh them differently. Go ahead.
But here's the thing. What if I'm a college, I'm a university, okay? Let's say I'm just going to throw a number out there. I want at least 10% of my student body, to be minorities, to be of the minority body. Well, what if after we get a whole bunch of applications in, there's no way from a GPA standpoint and SAT or ACT standpoint that any of the students who applied meet that criteria.
So that's the danger with quota.
Right. Yeah. So now, as a college or university, am I just supposed to admit students who I know
Yeah.
do not have a shot
Well,
to
Texas,
get a degree.
you know, Texas did set up a situation where the top 10% from every high school would get admission to the state university. So whatever community you came from, the top 10%. Now we obviously know.
And by the
there were
way,
some challenges with that.
70% of the minorities at the University of Texas, which would be chiefly black and Hispanic in that state, came from that 10% rule.
Wasn't that set back, though?
It was sent back to see what the current system was.
Based on
By
the-
the time the case got to the Supreme Court, the system that Abigail Fisher had sued about was no longer in existence at the University of Texas, which made it a very bad case to take to the Supreme Court.
Sure. You were trying to hop in a few minutes ago, Carolyn.
Well, I was just talking about, and not necessarily in academia, although perhaps I'd have to think it through, but sometimes there are special qualifications that one needs for certain positions. An example is that I work part-time for a nonprofit, the Chicago Legal Clinic, and I run a small immigration program. And one of the qualifications for anyone in that situation is you have to be able to communicate with your larger client populations, which is in this case Spanish.
Sure.
So do we see a role maybe in academia for people that have certain special qualifications above and beyond the usual ones of research and grades, et cetera? Do you think that would be something that would be considered affirmative action? Good business or what?
I would argue it's good business. and it
Right, me
makes
too.
sense.
That's good business. I mean, again, it goes back to the key word you said, qualifications.
Yep.
Qualified. Hire the most qualified person. If those people are the most qualified, hire them.
Yes.
Color should be blind. I know it's not.
Okay.
I know,
So
but it should be.
to your argument, because I'm interested in, and like all of us, I think we all know enough not to be blindly partisan on this issue.
Right.
And I think we all can sort of see this from various sides. But for someone who would ask the question, if you say, well, let's just be colorblind, what about those who say, yeah, but we have, you know, a couple hundred years of slavery, we have 100 years of Jim Crow discrimination, and we really have a situation in which the civil rights movement was just in the 60s, was not that long ago. How do we deal with the repercussions of our founding in this country, where there were certain people, namely African Americans, who have been locked out of mainstream institutions for years? How do we deal with that if we don't do some level of affirmative action?
And that's why I said in the beginning it's a necessary evil, because I think you have to have it. Because if we didn't have affirmative action, let's be honest, there would be a lot of black, Hispanic, Asian women who would not get that
Well,
opportunity.
the Asians would actually, and that's the
is
reality.
correct.
Okay.
They
Depends
test
on-
higher
I'm
than
correct.
most people.
Wait, wait,
in-
wait, wait,
yeah.
no,
But I
no,
didn't
no,
want
no,
you-
no,
but-
not
but I didn't want you-
necessarily. Not necessarily.
Okay.
Believe me, that is a nice little myth that's been going around. But what is an Asian? That's why I say it started out as East Asia, and now we've gone over to West Asia.
Okay.
We've gone beyond India. We've gone to Pakistan. We've gone to Iran. We've gone to the Arab world, and that just stuns me.
I don't mean to cut you off, but I will say there's a case right now, I believe it's in California, where they are, it is in California, where they have rewritten their affirmative action program so that it excludes Asians. Because the assumption is that they're doing way better than everyone else, including white Americans, in testing math and science, that sort of thing. So I would make the case in that situation that they would have a little bit different perspective. But to your point, we can get off on this. Asia's a large continent, and there are a lot of other countries we can deal with. So go ahead, continue, please.
But I didn't want to make sure that Mike didn't contradict yourself in terms of your first view and your latter position, which I wouldn't quite call it a necessary evil. I would say that while it is important that we field any position with the best qualified individual, that we're also mindful of deficiencies that were created in the past. And one way to account for that is what you are doing at the city colleges and what many universities, including mine, are also doing, which is to go back and identify the source of any deficiencies. The source is not going to be at the university level or at the employment level. Let's train up those people at the early stage and prepare them for college, for graduate education, and for careers, at the source, and not just to plug them from the source without preparing them and then say, hey, we're going to give you this position that you may not be qualified for.
And
And
that's-
that provokes a great deal of controversy. And I think that's what turns a lot of people off.
And that's my thing, you know, and that goes back to what I was saying about college admissions. What if, you know, a lot of these students who are applying for college just are not qualified?
You know, but I have a problem with that. I have to say this. I have a problem with that because what happens when you deal with legacy issues at colleges and universities, and say the son of someone who became president or something like that, right? Got into some elite schools because of who their dad was. I'm not going to name any names, right?
Yeah.
But let's just say, and not to throw anything negative out in that way, but let's just say that you have legacy issues. You have athletes. You have people who may not. Who are brought to the university for a variety of reasons that may not just be purely academic. And no one really says anything about those folks.
Yes.
Well, they do.
Yeah, they do.
They
Yeah,
do
they
say
do.
something.
Okay.
If you're an athlete,
But they're still there, and we're not having these major
they're
debates
not
about affirmative
always-
action around these folks.
People do, although it's not,
Not always still there.
although
Okay.
it's not as prevalent as the matter on the table, which is discrimination. That's actually the basis for this affirmative action, trying to repair the evils of discrimination in the past. Now, having said that, there's a point that you raised earlier concerning the disparity in employment between blacks and whites, especially those two extremes. And a lot of people will come back and say, well, maybe the reason that many blacks that blacks have such a high unemployment is because they are not quite as skilled, not quite as academically prepared. Now, though, it's interesting because one of the findings in the book I'm currently completing it's entitled "We Must Change the Way We Live." It identifies the fact that for blacks and whites with the same academic qualifications, that you still have that gaping hole whereby unemployment rate for blacks is twice as much still.
Yeah.
So it's a persisting statistic. Now, I say that to say this, that this is part of the reality that we cannot shy away from. So we have to carefully balance the top goal of fielding positions with the best qualified individuals with understanding that in some cases, two individuals may be equally qualified, and to repair any evils of the past, you have to give certain preferences, at least to ensure that that gaping hole doesn't persist.
That's interesting, and I think it's very well said. You know, most Americans support affirmative action if you ask them about it in theory, so specifically what you were talking about. But when it gets down 70%, when it gets down to the nuances and the nuts and bolts of affirmative action policies, when it comes to quotas and when it comes to that hypothetical situation, by the way, which doesn't happen as often as we like to believe, the two equally qualified people and then the black person gets it and the white person doesn't get it. In fact, I've read a study that said that if that were to happen, you know, all around and all of the unemployment of African Americans was gone through affirmative action, it would impact about 2% of the labor market. Among white Americans, so it wouldn't be this this victimization thing that's happening, where I feel like in America, sort of a lot of different groups are claiming victimization. I think that, as you're saying, when it comes down to, and most people agree with the principles, when it comes down to the nuts and bolts, that's what's difficult. As I was reading and preparing for this as well, many people asked the question. I saw this was interesting. They said, should someone like Sasha and Malia Obama, should they receive affirmative action? I know you would argue no.
No,
okay?
of course, right, you already know.
They're more important
But
their
they
father
probably
and
wouldn't
mother
do it
say
anyway.
no.
Yeah, no.
Exactly.
But what I'm suggesting is that when it comes down to it, most people agree with it in theory, but in practice they don't, specifically around issues of income, because there is once again the assumption, partially true, but there is an assumption that many African Americans are from disadvantaged backgrounds, and that increasingly is not the reality for many people, right? So how do we deal with that, right? How do we deal with, say, for full disclaimer, I was debating whether I would say this on TV, but I know for a fact in the past that I've benefited from affirmative action programs. And like yourself, I had mixed feelings about it. In fact, my dad and I had some pretty heavy conversations because I said, Dad, I don't want it. And he said, boy, you're a fool, because you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I said, well, we grew up and you were able to provide different things. And he said, I only was able to do that because I received assistance in certain ways and was able to get into some business opportunities. So it's a very interesting question, and it really, really is difficult to
Yet
pin
the
down.
truth is that
sorry.
many minorities, many blacks have never actually been beneficiaries of affirmative action. I've never been a beneficiary of affirmative action myself, and I know there's a lot of people who have not benefited from that because they got into where they were on account of their qualifications. And so it rubs them off wrongly when the suggestion of affirmative action is made
I hear you.
in a way to patronize them. So we have to be quite mindful.
Plenty of people
of
get
that
businesses
fact.
because their parents own
insulting
them too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, go
For
ahead.
people to assume.
Yes.
A friend of mine went to a local law school in the early 70s, said that it was assumed that she was there because of an affirmative action program, when in fact she met and exceeded the qualifications,
Sure.
but the males were assuming. And I recall in law school people coming up to me and saying, some guy's dying in Vietnam because you're taking a spot.
Yeah.
And again, that's very, very
Right.
offensive.
And I think it's foolish.
And it's not a bad thing to be a beneficiary of it and utilize it in ways that benefit you
Yeah.
and benefit others.
Because here's the deal: if you get a job because your family owns the company, so what? Right? Are you going to walk around with the stigma that, oh, I'm so unqualified because my dad runs the company, now I'm the vice president? Or are you going to take advantage of that opportunity that exists?
Well, of course, you're going to take
And I
advantage
think
of
a lot of people would.
Of course.
And so I think we've got to bring that into the conversation as well. You know, you were saying, Ann?
Yes, I mean, there have been many what you called legacy programs. Certainly in the days when we used to have a lot of small family-owned businesses, that meant that the child, typically the son, got to take over the father's business, and no outsider need apply.
Okay. We only have a few minutes left. I want to ask you this question to sort of close us out here, okay? Does affirmative action do more harm than good, right? And if it does or doesn't, what do we have to do going forward to deal with this issue?
I think it's a changing thing. It's what is the affirmative action and for which groups.
Okay.
I've always said I like the idea that the bottom 25% economically really must be sought out and
Okay. So you
really
think it
must
should
be
be
given help.
income and
Yes,
economically based?
It's what the president
Okay.
has said.
Okay. Yes.
I would tend to agree with that. I would tend to agree that, again, I'm extremely impressed that City Colleges has devoted the resources to helping people who don't meet qualifications, get them so that they can compete. And I am hoping that the transfer rate to the elite schools that have legacy programs like the University of Chicago, one of my alma maters, the University of Virginia, that they will also assist and take some of my marvelous students.
Thank you.
That's what I'm hoping.
We're out of time.
And
I'm
I
very
second
sorry.
everything that
Thank
Carolyn
you guys
said.
very much. That's our show for today. The conversation continues online at wycc.org. We'll see you next time on The Professors.